Hi everyone. So in this lecture what we're going to see is that we are going to give a brief introduction on deep neural networks. We have already seen how simple feed-forward neural networks work. And then we're going to to outline the motivation and challenges behind having deep neural networks. And we're going to provide some examples of how to pre-train neural networks, and finally about convolutional neural networks. So going a little bit into the motivation and challenges, traditionally what we have in tasks is that when we have an initial source of signal, either this is a speech signal or an image or any other type of information, usually we try to extract some meaningful features in order to get as much information as possible from the original signal, and therefore put this information in terms of features in the classifiers and then make a decision based on what the classifiers say. So for example, what happens is that if we have this image of a bus and we would like to actually identify the fact that this is a bus, usually in the traditional computer visions we have algorithms that detect the edges of the bus. We have also, after having detected the edges of the bus, we also pass this into some histograms in order to further compress the feature space. Sometimes we might even perform a k-means clustering in order to further encode and further compress the feature space. And finally, these features are the input of a classifier. It can be any classifier that we have seen so far, in order to make the final decision that this is a bus. Now, what happens with several deep learning models is that instead of taking all these steps in a knowledge-driven way, these steps now are being replaced by layers of a neural network. These layers, we have no idea what they're doing. They might be detecting the edges, they might be performing computations on the histograms of the edges, but essentially we have no idea what they're doing. So these layers result from the nonlinear combinations of the input pixels and the type of weights in the combinations, as well as what type of activation functions we can use after we take these nonlinear combinations, are being actually decided by training and tuning the neural network. This is what traditionally we call end-to-end learning, and there are several advantages related to that. The first advantage being that essentially the network learns information that it is relevant to the output of interest, instead of having a human integrated knowledge that essentially extracts information based on what we think that this is important. So the main disadvantage of this, of course, is that now we kind of lose any sense of interpretation, since we have no idea if these layers of a neural network represent something meaningful, rather than just nonlinear combinations of the input pixels. These are some examples of neural network architectures that have been examined throughout the several years. These are examples from Google, from other companies. Most of you are definitely familiar with VGG19 and VGG16, AlexNet, and other neural networks. And in fact, some of these neural networks, especially if an input is an image, are also publicly available, so that people can work on this. So we kind of explained what is having a deep neural network means. Now, what are possible reasons that having this multiple set of interconnected layers can benefit for us? First of all, one possible reason is that this having multiple layers can allow us a hierarchy. So this can be explained in the fact that, for example, the first layers of a deep neural network can be more representative of local transformations in the pixels of an image, while the later layers can be most informative of more general objects that are included in the image. Other than that, in addition to that, the multiple levels can allow some sharing among the multiple locations of the image, and that can allow to extract several meaningful combinations that are related to the outcome of interest. And of course, as researchers have seen throughout these last years, these deep architectures tend to work well among a variety of tasks, including computer vision, audio analytics, and natural language processing. So the main idea behind using deep neural networks is that these deep neural networks learn features from the data using multiple hidden layers. They include these differentiable functions, such as the activation functions that we have seen so far. So they are able to produce some features efficiently. They also allow this end-to-end learning, as we say, since instead of performing a manual feature design, we just put the raw input signal into the neural network and we let the neural network train in order to provide some meaningful information from what we're looking for. And finally, the fact that we have these deep architectures, meaning that we cascade multiple layers from simple nonlinear modules, can actually provide an advantage in terms of hierarchical representations, as well as in terms of providing more comprehensive representations of the input space. So here there is an example of an input image. This is the input of a neural network, and of course the input image contains RGB values. These RGB values are passed through multiple layers of the neural network. These are some examples. So typically what can happen is that in the first layer of the neural network, we might be able to represent the edges within an image, so more local representations within an image. Then as layers are progressing, we might be able to represent more high level of representations of an image, for example, the parts of a human face. And finally, in the later layers of a neural network, we might be able to represent more unified objects within an image, such as a face. So in addition to that, in addition to this hierarchical learning, another advantage of having deep neural networks is that we can provide some type of multitask learning. And what this means is that if we have tasks that are related to each other, for example, if we have images and we would like to say whether, for example, task number 1 is whether the person is a young person or an older person, and task number 2 whether the person is female or male, or task number 3 to perform speaker identification, person identification. So if we have interrelated tasks, then we can use an initial number of shared layers that learn some basic representations from the input space. And then in the later layers of the neural network, we can actually train weights so that they learn information specific to the task of interest. In this way, we do not have to learn huge networks from scratch for each task of interest, and also we might be able to take advantage of this interrelated information between the multiple tasks. Besides these advantages, deep neural networks have several challenges that need to be met. And of course, the first challenge that these deep neural networks have is that they require a very high memory capacity. So for example, if we have one of the large neural networks, like the ones that we have seen, like the VGG19 or even 50-layer neural networks, these neural networks have a lot of weights. For example, a 50-layer neural network can have 20 million weights that actually need to be learned. And in addition to that, they have 60 million activation functions that actually need to provide an input so that we can do the forward and the back, the forward pass and backward pass. So these parameters, first of all, because they are a lot, they take a lot of space, and second of all, they also take a lot of computational requirements. Of course, a very important thing is that now we have GPUs that are able to kind of mitigate these computational requirements. So another disadvantage when having deep neural networks is that from what we have seen so far, the easiest way to actually train a simple neural network is to perform backpropagation. However, the problem with backpropagation in deep neural networks is that usually it doesn't work very well. And the reason is that in backpropagation, we're computing the gradients of the weights, or the gradients of the cost function with respect to the weights. These gradients vanish very quickly. And by that we mean that the gradient based on which each weight is being updated is very quickly getting to a point of zero. So in that point, since the gradient of the weight gets to zero, then the weight essentially stops being updated. So the weights, when we are performing backward propagation in neural networks, might stop very quickly of getting updated. A potential way to mitigate this solution is to use what we call pretraining. So during pre-training, what happens is that we kind of initialize the weight of a neural network by actually passing the data to the neural network in an unsupervised way. In this way, we can think about that the weights are kind of initialized and we are having an initial idea of how the weights of the network will look like based on the data that we have. And after that, we can perform a backpropagation in order to refine these weights. Here, we provide an example of how several deep neural networks have performed with and without pre-training. So we can see here that a deep neural network with no pre-training can provide a test error in this specific task, a validation and test error of 0.2%. If similar neural networks are actually initialized using pre-training, then this error decreases. So we can understand that pre-training is a very important thing in order to mitigate several challenges. And next, we're going to see essentially two ways of performing pre-training in neural networks and how we are going to outline how this works. So the initial idea behind pre-training came from the fact that if we have a large neural network that we have trained for one task, then maybe parts of this neural network can be translated into actually finding something meaningful for another task. A very simple example is what you probably everyone has, many of you have heard, that we call VGG16 or VGG19. So what happens? These are neural networks that have been trained using a large set of images, mostly for object classification. But then these structures are provided to researchers in order to be refined for their tasks of interest. So there are two ways based on which we can actually pre-train some of these neural network structures in order to provide better training performance when we use backpropagation. So the framework that is used usually is that if we have a neural network for which we have randomly initialized weights, the first part is to perform some greedy layer-wise unsupervised pre-training in order to warm up these weights, as we're saying. So in order to have these weights take values that are somehow inspired from the data that we are looking for. And the second part, of course, is the supervised fine-tuning, in which we can use gradient-based optimization techniques in order to fine-tune our weights in a supervised way for the task of interest. So for the first part, now we are going to see two main methods. The first method is what has been initially proposed as deep belief networks, and the second method is what we call stacked autoencoders. And here, just to motivate further a little bit of why pre-training can be helpful, here is an example of a neural network that has been trained for a task of interest without pre-training. So this is the error that results with respect to the number of layers. And this is the testing error that results with respect to the number of layers when pre-training is used. So we can understand essentially that this procedure of pre-training has actually reduced the error significantly. Now, going to the deep belief networks, these were initially proposed in 2006 by Jeff Hinton. What these deep belief networks are based on are in what we call restricted Boltzmann machines. So the main idea behind using these deep belief networks is that we are performing a layer-wise pre-training for each layer based on the data that are passed on each layer. So we assume some type of joint distribution between the hidden and observed variables in each layer. For example, this can be an exponential distribution between the variables and the hidden states. And then we are trying to train to actually estimate the unknown parameters of the neural network, which are the weights and the constant parameters and the bias terms, such that we maximize the joint distribution between the hidden layers and the corresponding variables. So this, the gist of it is what has been described in restricted Boltzmann machines, and usually this can work pretty well. We do not provide any more details here, but if anyone is interested, then we can provide some handouts on how specifically these restricted Boltzmann machines work. But the main idea is that we assume a joint distribution between the observed variables and the hidden states, and then we try to maximize this distribution using the data that are being passed from each layer. So this is an example of how this works. This is, for example, in the first step of pre-training, in which we have our input data and then we have the hidden layers. So as we have said, we assume a joint distribution between these two. This joint distribution in this case is an exponential distribution. There have been works which have assumed different types of distributions, such as, for example, binomial distributions, especially if we have black and white images. And we are trying to actually maximize this distribution in order to find the optimal parameters W between the input features and the output of the activation functions. Of course, these weight parameters W have been randomly initialized, and then the first estimate of this is what comes from the input through the random initialization of the weight parameters. Now let's say that using this process we were able to find some weights that maximized the joint distribution between those two. Now we take this output that results from the input based on the weights that we have learned. Now, having this output, we do exactly the same in a layer-wise manner in order to pre-train the weights of the second layer. So what happens again is that we have these inputs that resulted from the first step. We pass these inputs initially through randomly selected weights, W2, and then we have a second hidden layer. So then we are trying to maximize the joint distribution between the output of the second hidden layer and the output of the first hidden layer, exactly in the same way that we did for the first step. Then some weights W2 are learned from this process, and the same way we are trying to do to learn the weights W3 for the third hidden layer of the neural network. So after we have done this, what has happened is that gradually we were able to pass the input data through several layers of the neural network, and then we were able to initialize the weights from these layers in an unsupervised way based on the input data. So in this way, the network has some idea on what data it is going to see. And then by pre-initializing these layers, after that, of course, we perform backpropagation, based on which we are trying to actually refine those weights with respect to the output of the neural network from the input data in a supervised way. The similar backpropagation techniques that we have learned for the actual multi-layer perceptrons. So these deep belief networks is one way in order to initialize, to pre-train the weights or the hidden layers, as we say, of the neural network. Another way to do that is through the use of the autoencoder. So the autoencoder is again another type of neural network. It is an unsupervised algorithm that tries to learn an identity function for the inputs of the neural network. So this autoencoder does nothing but having as an input the data that we are having, and as an output, the output layer has again the same input data. And the intermediate layers, in this case we only have one intermediate layer, is usually a compressed representation of the input. So essentially what this intermediate layer does is that it tries to provide another representation of the input data so that the input and the output of this neural network match with each other. The autoencoder is a very widespread type of neural network, and sometimes people just use it just for feature transformation or for dimensionality reduction. So we are using this autoencoder function here in order to pre-train the weights of each layer of the neural network. And the way that we are doing that is very similar to what we saw in the deep belief networks in a layer-wise manner. So first of all, let's say that we have this input, and let's say that we are trying to pre-initialize the set of the nodes from the first hidden layer of the neural network. So we are having this as an input to an autoencoder, whose output, of course, are the features that came from the input of the data. And we are trying now to actually learn the weights for the autoencoder for the hidden layers. So we are trying essentially to learn the weights that provide a more compressed representation of the input space. After now we have learned these weights from this first step, we remove the last layer of the autoencoder, we keep the first two layers, and then we add a second layer. So after we add this second layer, what happens is that now we have only the first layer, which is the output of the first hidden layer, and the second layer. And then we are trying to do exactly the same thing, in which from the associations between the first and the second layer, we are trying to learn an optimal optimal weight parameters through this autoencoder. So the same can happen gradually for all layers until we reach the output of the network. So this is another procedure in order to pre-train the parameters, the weights of the neural network. There are some advantages in terms of stacked autoencoders. First of all, that they can compress the input space. They are totally unsupervised, so we do not need labels in order to actually learn the weights for these networks. And then they can also capture a hierarchical grouping of the input. So we can assume that, for example, we do not only have one intermediate layer in these stacked autoencoders, but we can have multiple intermediate layers that can kind of capture this hierarchical grouping. Again, these autoencoders can be very useful for dimensionality reduction, and people use them for this reason a lot. So this is essentially the first part of this lecture, in which we have solved motivation and challenges behind using a deep neural network. As we have said, the main motivation behind using a neural network is that we can have data-driven representations of the feature space, and by having multiple layers, we can have hierarchical set of more comprehensive representations of this input space. But there are several challenges. The first challenge is in terms of computational complexity, and now we are able to solve that through GPUs. The second main challenge is in terms that because we have all these million parameters of weights, it is very hard to actually train these weights to get something meaningful, given the fact that we do not always have so many data that are being labeled. So a way in order to address this is from what we call pre-training. Pre-training is a way to actually give our network some initial idea about the kind of data that it is going to have. And we have seen two ways to perform pre-training, one with the restricted Boltzmann machines, with the deep belief networks, and the other with a stacked autoencoder. So in the next part of this lecture, what we are going to see is that we are going to see a very specific type of deep neural network, which are called convolutional neural networks, and are very extensively used nowadays.